I'm David Hume, and I have the great privilege of being the Chief Executive Officer of the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Centre. ESID is based, directed from the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, where it's been operating for coming up to 10 years now. But it's got a partnership that spans the right across the world. We've got partners in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, in the USA, and across Europe. And we've been working and researching in almost 40 countries over the last 9 to 10 years. Many of those partners are universities or research institutions, but also we are working with think tanks, with NGOs, with civil society activists, with private businesses, with investigative journalists at times. So it's been a geographically a very large partnership, and we've acquired tremendous support from the partners. I mean, the partners have really done amazing work and have worked together and collaborated and coordinated so effectively. We've been supported by the Department for International Development, as it was known. Now that's part of the FCDO, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And we certainly have to thank them for the resources they've provided, but also for the ways in which they've managed us. They've demanded accountability and that we report how we're spending the money and what we're achieving, and have breathed down our backs on that, but they haven't got involved in micromanaging us. They've allowed us to set the research agenda and to maintain our research independence, which is incredibly important. We've got 1 hour today, and Sam Hickey is going to try to give us an overview and a synthesis of what partners have been developing. If you take a look at the website, then well over 200 working papers now, 10 books that we've published, most of them open access, so they're free, another 5 books to come out, and a whole set of blogs and briefing papers. And I think on that slide you can see many of the major partners, as I say, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, the USA, from Europe, from all over the world, who've been working with us and have certainly made, have helped us to push forward knowledge in ways that we think has been productive. All of the work has been looking at the politics of development, a lot of it using a political settlement lens that Sam will talk to us about. We've been interested in what should be done to achieve development, but particularly our focus has been on the politics, on the how. We know what policies should be implemented, but how do you get budgets to them? How do you get trained staff who are motivated to deliver services or to support the growth of the economy? How does one do that? Sam will talk for about 30 minutes. If you want to ask questions, then if you put them into the chat box, we'll be able to take a look at those and move into those. If there is time at the end, we'll maybe allow 1 or 2 people to ask questions. Okay then, I hope I haven't forgotten anything. Sam, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, David, and welcome everybody. It seems we've got a number of people who in the room, so to speak, who are new to ESID's work, and a number of people who are longer term followers. So for the newcomers, this session is really about providing a bit of a gateway, so you'll get an overview of the findings, but an encouragement to dig deeper, both via the rest of the webinar series and the publications that I'll draw attention to. For those longer term followers, even addicts of ESID's work, we also have I guess a new fix for you. I'll be sharing some insights from a recently completed project on oil governance that will serve to also illustrate the overall findings of the Effective States and Inclusive Development Centre, with a particular focus on what we're calling the 3 C's of context, capacity and coalitions, which kept emerging as being really important drivers that we need a greater understanding of to get a grasp of how politics is shaping development. When ESID started out in 2011, it was really at the start of the first decade within which it could be said that politics had been taken seriously within international development by mainstream actors in theory and policy and practice. And this followed on from 2 or 3 decades of people shouting from the sidelines that politics mattered and should be mainstreamed within development theory and practice. But it's only really during the noughties, the first decade of this century, whereby international development actors become more persuaded by the logic that the ways in which they thought about and promoted different forms of politics by the good governance agenda in particular, the idea of exporting Western-style institutions to the global south, wasn't really working. It encouraged them to take more seriously what the actual drivers of elite behaviour were in developing countries, and a range of new theories started to appear to help them to do this, whether from Douglas North and colleagues, Acemoglu and Robinson, and also the work that we deploy on political settlements theory by Mushtaq Khan, which we thought was the most coherent and the one that offered most traction on our problems. This sort of new range of thinking has started to directly inform development policy and practice to a much higher degree than previously the case. As we'll see in today's focus on oil governance, there remains still a strong hangover of the good governance approach. So what do we do with political settlements thinking? So at the start of around 2010, it was clear that politics mattered, but it wasn't really clear how politics mattered. In what specific ways did politics drive development? And the theory that we've came up with was to adapt political settlement analysis as being one of the key domains of power, which shapes the extent to which elites become committed and states become capable of delivering development. Tim Kelsall will discuss the concept of political settlements in much more depth in next week's instalment of this webinar series. We've significantly rethought it from its origins in Mushtaq Khan's thinking and tried to actually measure them. That'll come next week. For the purposes of this week's presentation, a political settlement needs to be understood as being about the underlying configuration of politics and power relations, which shapes how institutions actually function in practice. The key player here within the political settlement is the governing coalition, which rules and holds the levers of power within a country, and which is shaped by relations of power in terms of those alternative coalitions that could displace them in power, so other elite factions which are competing for political power. The influence of different social groups, particularly organised around gender, ethnicity, class, whose interests and ideas have to be taken into account. And finally, paradigmatic ideas, which bind elites together around ideas of how politics, economy and society should be governed. Now, these all generate a series of ideas and incentives through which governing coalitions shape what happens in particular policy domains. And the policy domain is our second domain of power. And this is, if you like, a more politicised notion than sector. We thought that the way in which growth unfolded would be very different to the politics of how social service delivery unfolded. So we needed to understand what was going on in these domains. Now, different policy domains play different political roles, partly because they will deliver different mixes of rents and or legitimacy to ruling coalitions. So natural resources clearly delivers a lot of opportunities for elites to be involved in rent seeking. Whether that gets channeled into for public good or not is a separate question. Other domains might be more heavy with legitimacy in terms of delivery of education, health, social protection, for example. So that will affect the extent to which elites take these domains seriously, the extent to which they allow them to be well governed, the extent to which they politicise them and misuse them for various other purposes. As well as understanding the political role of policy domains, we need to understand their internal logics. There's stuff going on in policy domains around how actors and coalitions compete over their different visions of how health, housing should be organised and delivered. And there will be different governance arrangements in place through which that happens. So we need to understand the ways in which the interplay of these two domains of power happens, the political settlement and the policy domain, if we're to understand capacity and commitment to delivering development. So armed with this approach, we set off in 2011 to answer a series of puzzles which we didn't think had been adequately addressed within development theory, or policy for that matter, particularly those fields which have been more dominated by institutionalist analysis and had overlooked issues of politics and power relations. Now, I won't go through all of those questions there. What we did, though, was formulate comparative research within each of around 7 or 8 policy domains: education, health, women's rights, and so on. And we identified key shifts, key moments at which policy shifted, at which policy outcomes changed, and we traced back from those to investigate the political drivers. And we did this in over 20 countries, which we chose to represent different types of political settlement, particularly political settlements where power was more concentrated or dominant, as against political settlements within which power was more diffuse, deconcentrated, and where politics was more competitive. And we undertook probably over 80 now studies, all of which have been published or in the process of being published on the website, and some of which have reached wider academic publications. And I'm going to focus on the natural resource governance domain today to add a bit more depth before coming back to the broader range of findings. Now, looking at natural resource governance has become a very rich area of study from a political settlements perspective. And this is partly because of its significance, increasing significance over the 2000s to the development prospects of so many countries in the global south, amidst the commodity super-cycle, which ran from 2004 to 2014. And in one of our first studies there, Tony Bebbington, with the book there on governing extractive industries, worked with a series of colleagues to examine how politics shaped the natural resource sector and how the natural resource sector shaped politics and the political settlements in a range of long-standing producers in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. What we've done in this newer project, which I'm going to talk to now, is to try and explore what good governance, the good governance agenda means for a set of new producers in sub-Saharan Africa, which discovered commercial quantities of oil and or gas around similar periods in the 2000s, and which increasingly became subject to the rollout of the good governance agenda, whereby the main players around the good governance agenda saw natural resource arena as a new domain within which to start to advance the logics of good governance, even as the overall agenda was starting to creak. And those of you studying politics at Manchester will soon be delving deeper into the good governance agenda and its pros and cons. So what we see emerging over from the mid-2000s onwards is a sort of a new global epistemic community of actors who wanted to promote a particular vision of what good oil governance looked like. This is driven particularly by the World Bank, but also with Norway, with its own impressive history of oil governance to draw on. Supported by a second tier of bilateral agencies, including UK and US agencies, and a range of international non-governmental organisations concerned with issues of transparency and accountability. And there's 3 key planks, if you like, to this new oil governance agenda. One of which is the idea of the separation of powers, whereby governments with oil or gas to produce and market should separate out their regulator from their commercial operator or national oil company, for reasons I'll explain. Secondly, transparency and accountability, that the deal-making processes between countries and international companies should be as open and transparent as possible. And also the ways in which government generated revenue and spent revenue from oil should be as transparent and accountable as possible. And thirdly, that countries should adopt various modes of financial management to ensure that Dutch disease effects didn't take hold. For example, sovereign wealth funds. And what's interesting about this agenda is the narrowness of the ideological range This is primarily about getting the institutional arrangements in place to ensure a level playing field for investors, as well as ensuring accountability. And there's very little support for national oil companies to emerge and flourish. These are seen, particularly by the World Bank and the IMF, as essentially a disaster, only there to fuel rents to ruling coalitions, and not entities which, in the language of the World Bank paper there, the National Oil Companies and Value Creation, these were not seen as state-owned enterprises which could add any value to oil production and exploitation in these new countries. So a very narrow ideological range, not really accepting a more statist or resource nationalist version of oil governance, which some countries were keen on. Now, this is largely supported by the academics and think tanks which formed part of this global epistemic community, notably colleagues from Columbia, who you see there in the middle book. But you do start to see around the edges some NGOs, and increasingly with the African Development Bank taking an interest, a greater acceptance of the role that the state could play via its national oil companies to some extent. Some of the academics are really important here. Paul Collier and Tony Venables helped put together the Natural Resource Charter, which benchmarks how well governed countries are around oil governance. And Paul Collier is funded by DFID and a range of other actors to go out and spread the good word of oil governance in a whole range of new producers in ways that were fairly influential via high-level seminars. So there was a soft sell, along with some attempts to lever this agenda via the usual conditionality means, and the standard programs of financial and technical assistance were there as well. The bit that we focused on in our research is really the idea of the separation of powers, which comes from the Norway model, which the Norwegians themselves start to promote quite strongly from 2005, when they formed the Oil for Development, the OFD bilateral programme, which operates in all of the producers that we look at, and a great many more around the global south. And the key idea here is that good governance would mean that producer countries separate out their regulatory from their commercial functionings to ensure that their commercial operator, the national oil company, is not having an unfair advantage by being the one that enforces the rules both on itself and potential competitors, notably international oil corporations. So under the Norway model, government should have three different functional areas. The policy function, whereby the ministry, linked with Parliament and other ministries, put in place the rules for governing the sector and coordinated the sector. Then you have a separate regulator, which is there to enforce the rules and make sure everyone's subject to the same rules and regulations. And then third, if you insist, you can have a national oil company, but it needs to be separated out from those other functions. And there's a logic to it, clearly. But we wanted to question this. We wanted to find out whether or not a model which had emerged in Norway, a very well institutionalised democracy, with a high capacity bureaucracy, necessarily made the most sense for our range of 5 sub-Saharan African countries, which didn't look much like Norway. So we wanted to find out whether this new iteration of good governance worked in different political settlements, and we wanted to know if it improved the capabilities of those governments to govern oil in the national interest. Those were our 2 core questions. And these are questions that were asked by these excellent research teams in each of these 5 countries, each of which represents different types of political settlement, more competitive with Ghana and Kenya, more dominant with the other 3, and which have, well, 3 or 4 of them have similar sized fines in terms of their level of importance within the political economy, with Mozambique really being the major outlier here, with its massive gas fines, placing it in a higher tier of new producers. The others are really sort of mid-range and even lower tier producers, nothing like as significant fines as Nigeria, or let alone or Angola even. So not major, but we've seen significant shifts in the political economy of some of these countries since oil came on stream in some of them. So what do we find in terms of the first question? I mean, The model that hit the ground in every case was very similar to the model I've just outlined that was formulated at a global level. A limited ideological range, sold in pretty much the same ways in each case, with fairly limited efforts to contextualise this. We didn't find much evidence of, say, a prior political economy analysis being undertaken so that the external actors had a clear sense of whether the model would fit with the prevailing ideas and incentives within these countries. Unsurprisingly, we find some resistance. Sometimes this is because the governing elite is going through a particularly fractious moment, as Matt Tyce found in Kenya. And so there's a resistance because it's just not been taken particularly seriously. In other cases, there's resistance because ruling elites, for example, in Mozambique, have already put in place a tried and trusted strategy and means through which rents from the oil sector can be relayed into the governing coalition in ways that are beneficial, both for the ruling party and particular individuals, and they're reluctant to give new powers to new entities as a result of that. And there's also not much trust between the ruling party and senior bureaucrats. They're not very well embedded in the ruling party. So again, there's a reluctance to entrust new powers to these new entities, the new regulator, for example, that is being promoted. In nearly every case, in fact, in all cases, rulers are particularly resistant to the accountability and transparency agenda. And it's only really the strength of civil society in Ghana that's made that have any teeth in any of our countries. Ideology matters here in terms of past experience as well. For example, in Tanzania, which had already undergone through a period of neoliberal reform of its mining sector in the 1980s, I was very reluctant. It felt as though it had been sold out in that process and hadn't been able to add value to its resources before other firms came in and exported them. And they wanted to make sure they added value first and grabbed more of the resource for a statist agenda. This time around, and where you did have well-established national oil companies, as in the case of Ghana, they also resisted. They didn't see the logic of releasing their regulatory functions to a new entity which didn't have the same experience as themselves. But nonetheless, over a period of time, and sometimes it takes 3 to 5 years for these reforms to actually get accepted and embedded in, you do find compliance, and you do see that all of these actors have, in one way or another, all of these countries have, in one way or another, adopted the Norway model. But they've adapted it in ways that suit particular interests and ideas. Dominant rulers have been more active here. For example, President Magufuli has made sure that the policy function has been largely shifted towards the presidency and away from the ministry. You see bureaucrats welcoming the agenda, particularly those who see a logic in having the commercial national oil companies separate, away from what they see as the dead hand of the bureaucratic state. And you also find in our cases where you have ruling elites with a resource nationalist approach, countries that want to adopt a more state-driven approach and to secure more value internally rather than just automatically hand over oil reserves to international oil companies and then just tax what they manage to export through a more neoliberal mode. You do find countries like Uganda, for example, adapting what looks like a neoliberal mode of governmentality to a resource nationalist agenda, whereby you can have both a powerful regulator and a strong national oil company. At least that's the ambition. So these rules get adapted to suit local ideas and incentives. In terms of whether or not they've been effective in delivering on higher capacity to govern oil effectively in the national interest, we find a very mixed picture. And so looking at the 3 functions I introduced earlier, the policy function is where we've seen the greatest decline in capacity of governments in the aftermath of adopting these reforms. In every case, governments have struggled to coordinate across what is now a much more complex set of arrangements within their oil sectors. Previously, these functions were together, usually within the same organisational entity, and now you've had to set up and staff and run a series of entities and then govern them. And international efforts to foresee this and to put in place coordination mechanisms to offset that fragmentary effect were not really there. But it also comes from the convergence of this fragmentary form of governance with the highly fragmentary nature of ruling elites in developing countries, which I'll come back to. So, for example, in Kenya, you have a struggle between the two factions within the ruling coalition, which leads to the formation of a new Ministry of Petrol alongside the existing Ministry of Energy, with a lack of clear lines of responsibility and oversight over the regulator, for example. You also have other problems there, whereby if you're going to create bright, shiny new organisations, the semi-autonomous regulator, the new national oil company with inflated salaries and really nice vehicles and nice working conditions, then guess what? Your best staff are going to leave the ministry and go and work in those places. And so you see this hollowing out of the ministries in terms of capable staff, leaving either to join international oil companies or these new initiatives. So a real capacity issue there of staffing across this new high-end governance architecture. Moving across to the regulatory function, a bit more success here, a lot of capacity strengthening that goes on here, and you do find that some functions are performed effectively. A number of countries are able to signal to international oil companies that they are good places to invest and that their resources, their investments will be well regulated and well managed. We see that in Ghana, Mozambique, Uganda. But other aspects of regulatory functions, the ability to have oversight of what those companies are doing and the ability to make sure that cost recovery, whereby international oil companies often inflate the costs that they've sunk in investments in order to maintain a higher share of the profit that they take from production and the export of oil, really needs a strong regulator to oversee that. And it's very difficult to balance between a government regulator and a super high-powered international oil company with endless high-end lawyers to support it. And you only really see Uganda standing up to that challenge and being able to keep cost recovery claims down. Elsewhere, Ghana, the regulator has very little oversight. I see Abdul Ghafaru Abdullah has signed in for this seminar. He could maybe talk to this later. You have a regulator that's great at inviting investment, but then doesn't really know what the companies are doing. Little oversight of field plans, for example, let alone muscular attempts around cost recovery. And when it comes to national oil companies, we see a mixed picture there also, again, for quite different reasons. We see in Ghana, again, GNPC actually performing increasingly over the 2008 to 2016 period, a really impressive role in generating additional value, not just for reinvestment in the oil sector, but also acting as a means of investment elsewhere in the economy, funding major infrastructure projects which the government, undergoing a macroeconomic crisis for some of that time, wouldn't have been able to afford unless it had a pretty effective national oil company generating revenue. But that becomes much more difficult after 2016 when the new party in power, which lacks any strong embeddedness with the oil company. It was the alternative NDC party which established the National Oil Company back in 1984. And the new patriotic party in power since 2016 distrusts GNPC, sees it as just being an avenue through which rents are funneled into its political opponent. And it generally decimates the GNPC when it comes into power, lets staff go, reduces its role, has currently put in place a CEO and a chair of the board from competing factions of its own party, which has made it very difficult for GNPC to be effective. So that's why you get two arrows for Ghana. Elsewhere, you've seen different patterns. In Tanzania, you can't really blame the reforms for why TPDC has struggled. It's more that the government has put in place a fairly fierce fiscal regime, which has scared off any investors. Mozambique's a different type of story. It's performing pretty well, the national oil company there, in terms of generating rents, but these are largely being funneled to ruling elites rather than being funneled back in to the budget for public gain. So a mixed picture there, and very little support for national oil companies due to the ideological bias of the good governance agenda. So what we find here is that the three C's really matter. That the context, the political settlements and the political settlement dynamics really matter, and the extent to which these reforms take hold, the form they take, and how effective they are in terms of building higher level governance capabilities in these countries. We find that the key problem is where you essentially have this overlaying of fragmentary governance reforms on increasingly factionalised political settlements, which is obviously to be expected in countries with new resource finds, that there's new goodies to be fought over already by elites. If you then move in and create new entities, which will themselves have a role in governing the flow of rents, as well as creating high-end jobs and job creation possibilities, then you create new sets of things for elites to compete over. And that's what you see in these cases, particularly in cases like Kenya, which is where Matt Tyce came up with the phrase resource factionalism, which characterises what happens in an increasing range of our countries, actually. In Uganda, Ghana as well, albeit the factionalism is largely between coalitions in Ghana. But we do see examples of developmental patronage, if you like, of resource nationalism. And this occurs either where you have a dominant coalition in power, and or you have a party or ruling coalition which is committed to a model of resource nationalism, which is moderate, not the hardline version, which Tanzania has increasingly gone down and which reduces investment, but a more moderate version which welcomes investment but which preserves a strong role for the state through its national oil company. And where we've seen that for brief periods in Ghana, in the mid-2000s in Tanzania, some stages for Uganda as well, then you've seen some progress in terms of the sectors in ways that you could argue is within the national interest. It's not done through necessarily on a rules-based way. This is based on fairly informal links between rulers and bureaucrats who are often very politically loyal and agree to potentially sort of look the other way sometimes, but in return for largely being given the autonomy to do their jobs as highly trained geological experts effectively. But the geopolitical context is also important here, and that we do find that, for example, the trade war between China and the US, which unfolded over the last few years, has had a fragmentary effect within our cases. And we see, for example, deals being made around major infrastructure projects within the oil sector in countries like Uganda being tilted away from probably the best decision that could have been made for the national interest towards an alternative route that suited various geopolitical interests. Coalitions. So we find that the outcomes in our sector are heavily driven by the coalitions that take place between coalitions at multiple levels, transnational, governing, and between politicians and bureaucrats, particularly in ways that shape the capabilities of pockets of effectiveness to do their jobs effectively within these countries. And this implies a whole range of strategic implications for how donors should perhaps have acted around oil governance that we can come back to if we have time. David's just waved at me. So let me move on from the specifics of oil governance to the broader arena of ESID's work. Again, through the three C's. So our work on in other domains also emphasises the significance of political settlements in shaping the context within which development takes place. Work led by Tom Lavers on the rapid spread of cash transfers in particular in sub-Saharan Africa has pointed out that although previous analysis argued that this was all about being an externally driven, donor-driven case, or was about elections within sub-Saharan Africa, actually political settlements really matter, that the reasons why countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, Mozambique have actually gone quite a long way to institutionalising cash transfers are very different reasons to those that have taken place in competitive countries. For these more dominant countries, it's about a sense of legitimacy and a sense of vulnerability to threats, either towards the settlement itself or the ruling coalition. whereas elsewhere, and elections really don't matter, whereas elections have mattered in countries like Ghana, Kenya, and to some extent Zambia. So there's different routes through which countries arrive at fairly similar outcomes, which are important when it comes to working out how to work with those different political dynamics. Work on growth and structural transformation has pointed out that institutionalist theory really can't explain why countries grow in different ways, why they take off, and why they sustain growth. For example, growth takeoff often took place under fairly dominant, less than competitive settings where deals were made with politically connected actors. But that becomes increasingly difficult if you want to broaden out and sustain growth and move into structural transformation. Then it's pretty likely that you'll need to open up that deal making to less politically connected firms. But even there, the deals don't necessarily need to be entirely rules-based. So you can catch up with that. Both of these are open access books available via the website. In terms of the second C of, oops, where's coalitions gone? I'll deal with this one first. Coalitions. With the work on education, which Naomi Hussain led and we'll talk to in a later webinar, we found, as we did in so many projects, that coalitions are really critical for acting as the interface between configurations of power, institutions and policy. And Naomi will report on our findings whereby countries which have done really well in allowing access to flourish have actually not done very well in terms of making sure that kids actually learn very much when they're in school. And we trace this back to the various strengths of different coalitions. The coalitions behind access, very strong, involving populist presidents, large rural constituencies and teachers' unions, versus firms that need to be upgrade their educational workforce to be competitive in global terms, of which there are fairly few in our country, and middle-class parents who've often exited the public sector to go for private provision. So the imbalance between coalitions helps explain why the access agenda still trumps the learning agenda in many countries. Our work on gender equity, led by Sohaila Nazneen, who also has a webinar in this series. She will report on newer work. The older work in the book there really looked at the politics of domestic violence and showed that the coalitions that female activists had to engage with differed by different types of political settlements. That it really mattered who you built your alliances with, depending on the different political settlements you were within. Political parties came out quite badly in competitive settings compared to building links with Democrats in government bureaucracies, for example. And on capacity, our final C, a work by Anthony Savoya and Kunal Sen showed that the biggest single variable of political development that can be mapped onto whether countries are likely to achieve the MDG agenda it's also been traced against SDG achievement now, was about state capacity. And this is something that has gone a little bit missing within the good governance agenda. We found that to be significant in how growth and services are provided, but we found that it's unrealistic to have this expected across the board, and that pockets of effectiveness, which colleagues will report back on beyond the oil sector in the closing webinar of this series on the 17th of December, may provide the basis for a more realistic governance agenda. So strategically, what we sought to argue is that we need to have a rebalancing of the international agenda on governance. That even when we get to the part of the SDG agenda within which politics is taken most seriously, SDG 16, there remains a tendency to focus on the aspects of inclusion and accountability, which are obviously important, and to underplay the aspect of effectiveness and capacity in comparison to those. This has been a difficult argument to make at this moment, where donors who had previously sort of moved away a little bit from the precepts of good governance then start to be challenged by the increasing threats that the global liberal order is under from an increasingly aggressive forms of authoritarian populism, and a reluctance and a sort of move instead to double down on certain aspects of good governance. And we'd argue that this is understandable, but potentially a mistake, and it overlooks the central importance that state capacity has played in the development of not just liberal but social democracy in the global south and the global north, and that it's a sort of untold part of a progressive agenda for the politics of inclusive development that we shouldn't allow to be captured by those arguing in support of authoritarianism or from a highly conservative perspective, but rather state capacity really matters in terms of protecting the national interest versus the predations of global capitalism, and working against the commodification of that process. So there's some really progressive agendas to be pursued around capacity agendas, an interesting one being about taxation that we might have time to get into. Second C, there's lots to do around coalitions. Increasingly, international development actors get this. The Department for International Development, now FCDO, has invested quite a lot in, rather than imposing shiny new policy reform agendas on countries, instead stepping back and working out what are the coalitions that need to be built, and which ones may already exist in ways that can then provide the political basis for reform agendas to be taken forward. Lots more to be done on that, and working out the modalities requires a huge amount of trust and very difficult to build a log frame around. And finally, context. It was already established when ESID came along that thinking and working politically mattered, that you needed to have best fit rather than best practice. What we've tried to show is that what we need to fit with is particular types of contexts, that different types of political settlement will require different types of interventions. So we've tried to nuance that agenda a little bit. And finally, we hope we've added quite a lot of value to how the politics of development is theorised. The first phase of ESID work, which I've largely spoken to here, we've sought to promote political settlements theory as a kind of mid-range theory. That goes beyond in some ways, but also complements these long-run historical explanations for why some countries are richer than others. And what we try to explain is what happens within these more proximate time frames, the 2 to 3 decades of the generational epochs within which there's still an awful lot of variation between countries which have more or less similar institutional endowments, occupying more or less similar parts of the global political economy. And that's where political analysis can add a lot of value in showing why we see different results emerging both between and within countries. And that's how we deployed political settlements in the first range, and we're developing up the theoretical takeaways from that. But we started to get more ambitious. As ESID Phase 2 came to a close and is coming to a close now, we backed some work by Tim Kelsall, Nikolai Schultz and colleagues that will be supported or presented next week, which is much more ambitious and tries to argue that political settlements can actually take a step up and offer an overarching theory for explaining the politics of development. So you can see what you think of that next week and how it's played out in some of our other work later in the series. I'll stop there. Thanks, David.